Fish debate on Is There a God? My name is VJ and I work for Purple Fish, and we are a new events-based initiative in the town that put on various events around Oswestry. And one of the things that we just love to do at Purple Fish is just to create space for conversation. So whether it's at a debate with a serious topic or whether it's at a relaxed social event like a quiz night, we just love to hang out with people, have conversations and just build a relationship with each other. But a bit more about Purple Fish later. I'm just going to hand straight over to our chairman for the night. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Paul Stockdale, who will be, Paul will be keeping us in check through this evening. And as the former headmaster of Oswestry School, he has a bit of experience in that department. So I will hand straight over to Paul, who will introduce us to the two debaters, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Can I extend my welcome to you as well, to the debate, Is There a God? Putting forward the case for there being a God, on my right is Richard Lucas. Richard is part of Solas, a centre for public Christianity based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and is a frequent speaker for them in public debates, as well as having his views featured regularly in the Scotsman's newspaper. He's a member of King's Church in Edinburgh and works full-time as a maths teacher in Murchison Castle School in Edinburgh. Positing the opposite position, that there is not a God, is Andrew Copson. Andrew became Chief Executive Officer of the British Humanist Association a couple of years ago, I think, and has been working with them for a longer time. He regularly represents humanists on television and radio, as well as writing which appears in The Guardian, The Independent, The Times and The New Statesman. He's currently first Vice President of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, where he leads on communications. He studied classics and ancient and modern history at the University of Oxford. The format of the debate is as follows. Each speaker, Richard will go first, will be allowed up to a maximum of 25 minutes to put their position. Then each speaker will be allowed 7 minutes, up to 7 minutes, to rebut the points made by the other speaker. And then in response to that, each speaker will have a further opportunity of 4 minutes, up to 4 minutes, to counter those points. Following that, there may be a break, there may not, but there will be, after that, an opportunity for questions, which will be around about, we think, 40 minutes. At the end of that, there will be a 2-minute opportunity for both Richard and Andrew to draw their thoughts together and make some concluding comments. And then I will close the debate and then hand over to VJ. Just 2 further points, if I may. The first one is during the time of questions, the word is questions, not speeches. So if I can invite you to ask your question as briefly, as succinctly as possible, and then that gives opportunities for both Richard and Andrew to, depending on who you address the question to, either of them or both, of course, to give them an opportunity to respond. And then the final thing I'd want to say before I hand over to Richard is that there won't be a vote at the end of this debate. Rather, we hope that we've had an intellectually stimulating and thought-provoking evening that will get us away mulling over things that have been raised on both sides of the argument, and then hopefully there will be opportunities for you to enjoy conversation when the debate is finished, both now and later. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard to put forward, Is There a God?
Thank you very much. Thank you to Purple Fish for organising this and for inviting me along. Thanks to Andrew for coming along as well, and for Paul for sharing. Hopefully you do find it a stimulating, thought-provoking evening. So is there a God? I'm going to present 5 arguments this evening for the existence of God, and I'm going to go straight into the first one, which is based on the origin of the universe. And I'm going to start off presenting 2 philosophical arguments related to this. And my first argument demonstrates that time must have had a beginning. And this argument just goes like this. If time was infinite in the past, if time didn't have a beginning, how much time would have had to pass to get to now? And the answer is, an infinite amount of time would have had to pass to get to now. But the definition of an infinite amount of time is an amount of time that you never get to the end of. So it's contradictory. Therefore, time must have had a beginning. Here's another philosophical argument. Everything that exists had a cause of its existence. So therefore, whatever caused one thing to exist, something else must have caused that to exist, something else must have caused that to exist, etc. But that chain of causation can't go back infinitely, or nothing would ever happen. Think about it this way. If we wanted to borrow a book from me, and I said, yes, I've got the book, that's fine, but I've lent it to a friend, I need to get it from my friend. And I went to my friend, so I'm going to have the book, and he said, oh, I've lent it to my friend. And he goes to his friend and says, oh, I've lent it to a friend, I need to get it from him. If that chain goes on forever, will we ever get the book? No, of course we won't. We'll only get the book if eventually we get to someone that says, I don't rely on someone else to give me the book, I've got it. And that can start the chain off. Now, for centuries, thinkers have looked at these two arguments and used them as evidence, as arguments for God creating the universe. But scientists and atheists have tended to respond by saying, no, we think the universe could be eternal, it could have been here forever, and that was their response. But unfortunately for atheists, science has progressed since then. And in the last 100 years, astrophysicists have agreed that the universe came into being in the Big Bang 15 billion years ago. It's a well-attested theory called the Standard Model. And at the Big Bang, space and time, matter and energy came into being. Arno Penzias, Nobel Prize winner in physics, said this: astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing. And the Big Bang fits perfectly with the philosophical arguments that are presented, time having a beginning, and getting to the point where all the chain of physical causation has a beginning, the end of the chain of physical causes. So what made it happen? Surely everything that happens must have a cause. Well, what must that cause be like? It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial. In other words, beyond any sort of scientific analysis. So what could it be? There are only two options available, I think. Either God, or that the universe popped into existence uncaused out of nothing. Now, the famous British physicist and writer, P.C.W. Davies, he put the choice like this. Either you believe that the universe has no cause, or you believe it has a supernatural cause. A universe from nothing with no cause, I think that's entirely irrational. A universe brought into being by an act of God is not. So my second argument is relating to the fine-tuning of the universe. Unfortunately for atheists, physics made huge advances through the second half of the last century in understanding the interaction of fundamental particles, the fields that make up matter, and the laws that govern them. And they looked at various fundamental constants, like the strengths of the various nuclear, gravitational, electromagnetic forces, initial characteristics of the Big Bang. And using their mathematical models, they started to see how things would be. What would the universe be like if these values were very, very slightly different? And time after time, they made an amazing discovery. And the amazing discovery was that these values needed to be virtually exactly what they were. If you change them by the tiniest amount in either direction, the universe would not be a place where there could possibly be life. Because intelligent life depends on a complex set of initial conditions in the Big Bang and very finely tuned constants and also the ratios between them. Just to give you two examples. The ratio of the strength of the electromagnetic force to the gravitational force. If that was different, now these numbers are quite hard to explain, if that was different by 0 point and then 38 zeros, 1%, if it was different by that much, there would be no suitable stars to be a stable sun to enable life to develop in the universe. The expansion rate of the universe, if that was different by 0 point, then 53 zeros, 1%, if it was different by that much, bigger, no galaxies would form, life would be completely impossible. If it was smaller by that amount, the universe would collapse before you could even have stars forming. Again, life would be entirely impossible. And there's a whole string of fine-tuned constants and ratios like that scientists have discovered. This is what Sir Fred Hoyle, Cambridge University mathematician and physicist, said on this topic. He said, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the laws of physics. I do not believe that any physicist who's examined the evidence could fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed. Michael Turner, astrophysicist, University of Chicago. The precision is as if one could throw a dart across the entire universe and hit a bullseye 1 millimeter in diameter on the other side. Now, the biggest number I've seen related to this was from Professor Roger Penrose, who's a professor of maths at Oxford University. He looked at the fine-tuning of the entropy of the early universe. And he said it needed to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power 123. To give you an idea of how big that number is, if you tried to write that number down, if you wrote the 1 on an electron, and then you started writing a 0 on every electron, proton, and neutron in the whole universe, you would run out of protons, electrons, and neutrons in the entire universe before you could even write the number out. And that's how accurately the early entropy of the universe needed to be fine-tuned. Just look at some other things. Carbon is uniquely suited for creating complex biological molecules. Life with any other element would be impossible. Also, hydrogen and oxygen combine to form water, which is crucial for life, and they're also crucial in combining with carbon, again, to produce life. And it just so happens that those 3 elements are 3 of the top 4 abundant elements in the universe. The way carbon is produced in stars is an amazing, again, feat of fine-tuning. Stars function as carbon factories, virtually. Water, we take water for granted as a fairly normal substance, but actually its characteristics are really strange and unusual. It's about the closest we've got to being a universal solvent. Very high specific heat capacity, very high latent heat of vaporization, very high surface tension. It expands when it freezes. These are really unusual characteristics of water, and without them, life would be completely impossible. So what's the best explanation for this fine-tuning? I think the best explanation is that God designed the universe as an environment for life. And surely Andrew's got to concede it would have suited the atheist case better if scientists had discovered it didn't really matter what these values were so much. You could take anything, cobble it together, and things worked out. But that's not what science has discovered. Okay, my third argument is related to the origin of life. Now, Charles Darwin originally came up with the idea that life, the original life, the first cell came together by a random combination of chemicals in a warm pond, as he described it. Now, in Darwin's day, that wasn't too incredible, because a living cell was just seen as a little blob with a black speck in the middle. You could see it down a microscope. But again, unfortunately for atheists, science has advanced since then, and it's exposed the molecular machinery, the incredible intricacy, the technological sophistication that's to be found in a living cell. I've just got a quick video to play in the background. This shows DNA being reproduced in a cell. This is the sort of thing that's going on in your body now. And this is just one of many, many processes that are going on within the living cell. Now, as an atheist, you have to believe that this first living thing, the first self-replicating organism, came together by an entirely random process. Because all living cells are, roughly speaking, equally complex. There are not simple ones and more complicated ones. Every living thing is made up of cells of roughly the same sort of structure with the same sort of complexity in them. Now, George Whiteside is a chemist at Harvard University who works on the origin of life, and this is what he said about it. We have no idea how simple reactions might have blundered together to make the first protocell. Monkeys sitting at typewriters pecking out Shakespeare seems like child's play by comparison. So while scientists working trying to explain the origin of life as a chance event are failing, scientists who are uncovering the complexity of the operation of the cell are discovering layer after layer of sophistication. This is a quote from Thomas Nagel, who's a professor at New York University. He wrote this in a book last year. The more we learn about the chemical basis of life, the more unbelievable the standard historical account becomes. The idea that a self-replicating machine, completely beyond human technology, happened in one jump by chance is incredible. Because evolution can't play a part. Evolution can't start until you've got something that can start reproducing itself. Now, I just want to try and illustrate to you the limits of chance as an agency to put together a complex object. Now, probability theorists, they talk about something called the universal probability bound. And they say if anything's more unlikely than that, you've really got to say chance cannot possibly be an explanation for it. You've got to dismiss chance. This is how they work it out. They say the number of particles in the universe, like protons, electrons, etc., there's about 1 with 80 zeros after it. The number of times a particle can translate from one state to another per second is about 1 with 45 zeros after it. Okay? The age of the universe in seconds is 1 with 25 zeros after it. So probability theorists multiply all those numbers together and they get 1 with 150 zeros after it. So in other words, if every particle in the universe, zillions of times a second for the whole history of the universe, had been trying to do this thing, if your probability is worse than that, then you just still wouldn't expect it to happen. They call it the universal probability bound. So for example, if you went to a concert, Beethoven's 5th Piano Concerto, and the pianist played it note perfect, then stood up at the end and said, I can't actually play the piano, I've just been banging away at random, and it just came out right. You'd obviously say, I'm not even going to entertain that as a possibility. And the reason is, that's beyond the universal probability bound. But some, for example, a single protein in a living thing, some of them, statisticians have calculated the probability of a single protein in a cell coming together can be as high as 1 with 40,000 zeros after it. Just to try and illustrate the universal probability bound. This is 48 Lego bricks. If I broke this and gave you the same 48 bricks and said, build yourself a new tower, pick one, put it at the bottom, put the next one on top, next one on top, next one on top, and just any way you like to make an alternative tower, the chance of you making the same tower as me is lower than the universal probability bound. So you'd have to dismiss that as chance is not a plausible explanation. So if Andrew believes that life arose by chance, he must believe that the first living organism was easier to put together by chance than my 48 Lego bricks. I think anyone who defends that, that's just sheer faith in the teeth of the evidence. Now, before Richard Dawkins, the most prominent atheist in Britain was a professor called Anthony Flew, a sort of polite version of Richard Dawkins. Late in his life, he looked into this issue. He looked at the complexity in the living cell, and he said this. He said, it's become inordinately difficult to even begin to think about reconstructing a naturalistic theory of the evolution of the first reproducing organism. So he decided it was evidence for God. He followed the evidence where it led, and he started believing in God. Now compare that with another view from a researcher at Kansas State University who said this. Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. Now, I'm with Professor Flew. I'm happy to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence from the complexity of life points towards a designer, points towards the existence of God. Right, my next argument is to do with objective moral values. Now, I'll start off by making it clear what I mean by objective moral values. I mean this. If someone says torturing babies for fun is okay, they are as wrong as if they said that 2 + 2 = 5. Because torturing babies for fun is wrong, regardless of what society you live in, regardless of your personal opinion, regardless of what age you live in, because torturing babies for fun is wrong, is a fact. Now, how can an atheist account for these moral facts? Well, there's 3 options open to an atheist. The first one, evolution. They could say over millions of years, there was a benefit in caring and cooperating, and this has become hardwired into our psyche. And that might be true. But if that's the case, why are we obliged to follow these evolved instincts? Do what comes naturally is not a moral principle. Follow your psychological urges is not a moral principle. So evolution might explain why we sometimes behave morally and why we have moral intuitions, but it can't explain why we should live in accordance with them. And that's what morality is all about, knowing what we ought to do. Okay, 1 down, 2 possibilities left for the atheist. Social convention. Evolution is something that arises in a society. So if you say something's immoral, something's wrong, what you're really meaning on this view is we don't approve of that in our society. There's 2 problems with that view. There's not a moral principle that says we have to conform to society's moral standards. Society's moral standards can be wrong. The second problem with this view is it inevitably leads to relativism. If a society believes that torturing babies for fun is okay, it's not just different, it's wrong. It's morally deficient. Now, a relativist might say, oh, but it's true for them. Or you might think torturing babies for fun is wrong, but that's just you. And I think if you adopt that sort of relativist view, then that really is the end of morality. Okay, the third option for the atheist, they can say we can use our reason, we can think up moral values for ourselves. And they might be buoyed with hope at this prospect by looking at university philosophy departments, where ethicists surely are creating moral systems using reason, evidence, and logic. But they're not. That's not what they're doing. What they start with are our moral intuitions, things that we just know that can't be rationally justified. And they take those intuitions and try and systematize them and distill their essence into ethical theory. But note where it starts. It starts with the intuition, not with reason. Now, these intuitions, like don't hurt people unnecessarily, we all know them. We know they're true. I'm not disagreeing with them, but I'm saying they can't be justified rationally. Now, I think often atheists, they have these three approaches, and it's not that they're not enough on their own, but if you mix the three together, you can get there. I think that doesn't work. Each of them is completely unsuccessful in accounting for objective moral values. And even when they're mixed together with some rhetoric about human progress and the struggle of development of the human morality, they still just don't work. It's three solutions that don't work. So how can we account for objective moral values? Well, I think we can account for them with God. We regard intuitive moral principles such as don't hurt people unnecessarily as reliable and objective. And we're fully justified in doing so if they're perceived through a God-given conscience that gives perception of an objective moral realm reflecting God's ultimate standards of goodness. Why should we accept objective moral standards if they're not grounded in God? Why should we regard our most basic moral intuitions as authoritative if they're not given by God? There's no adequate answer to these questions, so I conclude that the existence of objective moral standards is evidence for the existence of God. Right, my fifth and final point is to do with consciousness and free will. Obviously, by consciousness, I mean our experience of being alive, our perception, our emotions, our thought stream. And experts, to be frank, are entirely clueless about how to account for the existence of consciousness. Dr. David Chalmers, director of the Center for Consciousness Studies, one of the foremost thinkers in the area, was asked once, do you think it will ever be possible to explain consciousness by science, like science can explain DNA, for example? And he said, no, he doesn't think so. Consciousness is inherently scientifically inaccessible. You could describe every detail about the behavior of the neurons in your brain, but that wouldn't explain what it's like. If you're eating a strawberry, you can have every detail about the operation of the atoms or whatever in your brain, but you couldn't find out what it's like to taste a strawberry. So how can an atheist give an account for consciousness? Well, the atheist has to believe that the brain is an electrochemical machine that follows the laws of physics ultimately, and somehow or other, this machine must give rise to this non-physical consciousness. Now, you might find that plausible. Personally, I don't, but you might find that makes sense. But if that is the case, that's a one-way street. The brain produces consciousness, but consciousness is not physical. So consciousness can't, in turn, affect the brain. The non-physical can't affect the physical. So if consciousness is supposed to have evolved, the question's got to be why? Because it's useless. It can't help you finding food or reproducing or surviving in any way. It can have no function because it can't have any effect. It can't cause anything. So the atheist must believe that it's an accidental byproduct of other things. So the most amazing and important feature of the universe, our consciousness, the only thing that gives life meaning and purpose, gives the universe meaning and purpose, the multifaceted phenomena of personhood must be regarded as an accidental, useless byproduct of evolution. Now, I find evolutionary accounts quite hard to swallow, even when I can see the purpose of the thing that's evolving. But consciousness, definitely cannot have any useful purpose to survival or anything else on an atheist worldview. To follow up on that, on the atheist view, with the brain just being a physical system, that also makes free will an illusion. All the choices that you think you make, you couldn't actually have done otherwise on an atheist view. Therefore, moral responsibility has to go out of the window. If you go into a court now, if you're charged with a crime, one of the roles of the court is to decide whether you are morally responsible for that crime. If you were drunk or if you're having some sort of psychotic episode, they might decide, well, you couldn't actually help it. You couldn't have done otherwise, and they'll take that into account. Surely, as an atheist, your verdict on everybody must be, well, they couldn't help it. It's just their brain followed the laws of physics, and so it just happened. No, they couldn't have done otherwise. Blaming a person in a moral sense becomes as senseless as blaming a computer. We'll lose our rationale for punishment. An atheistic worldview can offer no plausible explanation of the existence of consciousness and requires us to deny our experience of free choice as an illusion. Belief in God, on the other hand, opens up the possibility of explaining consciousness and its purpose and retaining a sense of personal moral accountability. I believe the 5 arguments I've presented tonight constitute a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I now invite Andrew to take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much. In a discussion of whether or not something exists, obviously the burden of proof is on the person who is claiming it does exist. So I think it's quite right that the case 4 went first this evening. It does mean that what I'm going to try to do, as well as advancing some arguments of my own, is to respond straight away to some of the arguments that are made. Because if I don't respond to the arguments 4 that are made straight away, I'll have very little to say. You can't speak for very long trying to demonstrate a negative, trying to demonstrate the non-existence of something. The burden of proof is in the other direction. So what I'm going to do is give some good reasons to believe that gods generally and specific gods, the idea of God generally and specific gods, are human constructs, things that human beings have made up in their own imaginations, things that exist only in our minds. But then I'm going to come on to speak, as it were, against some of the arguments that you've already heard. So I've been making my notes about those 5 arguments that we've just heard, and I'll use those to respond to them. But I'll start by giving some of the good reasons to believe that God generally, the idea of God generally, and individual and specific gods are things that are manufactured by us, by human beings. God fall down on our fields, God fall down from the sky onto our fields, is the first prayer that is written in Europe, written in Greek. Is the earliest surviving prayer that we have from Europe. And the reason why it's very interesting is because it doesn't ask God to send rain. It doesn't say, God, please send down rain to water our fields. It asks God itself to fall down. God is being used here as a word to actually mean rain. And that is entirely typical of a lot of early ideas of both gods and goddesses. The divine is a manifestation, a personification of natural forces that exist around us and to which human beings find themselves sometimes frighteningly subject. The rain, the sea, earthquakes, the seasons themselves, the sun, the moon, and so on. And that illustrates, I think, a very important truth about the origins of ideas of gods. Now, obviously, we know that rain is not in itself an entity capable of being prayed to and called down and appeased and brought into our lives in the way we want it to be brought into. But I think we can see very easily how it can once have seemed to our distant ancestors that it was the case. In the human world, the world as we experience it in our lives, effects have causes, actions have intentions behind them. And the association between those two ideas, cause and effect, action and intention, is locked into the way that we see everything around us. So it makes sense that people would try to find the same rhyme and reason in the world beyond us, in the natural world around us, and in the wider universe of which we're a very small part. We try to personalise that world to make it make sense. So you can trace the ideas of not just God generally, but specific gods through human culture and watch them change. There seems to be nothing unchanging, revealed, consistent, persistent about any of those ideas. Gods are ever-changing. We have good reasons to believe that gods are made up. We can see how different cultures use them to answer questions that they don't know the answers to. We can see that they look a lot like the cultures that make them up, and often the people who believe in them. We can trace the influence of different religions on each other and their historical development, and conclude that they probably don't reflect an ultimate reality, but instead reflect the human circumstances of the times that they originate and the times that their believers live in. Now I'd like to come on to deal with some of the arguments that have been made. And the first one, I think, was that the universe must have a cause, and that therefore a good reason exists to believe that that cause was God. The idea put forward is everything has a cause. Everything that exists has a cause. The universe obviously exists, and therefore the universe must have a cause back at the beginning of it. And therefore, we're supposed to believe the only possible cause of the universe, which must have a cause, is what we could describe as a god. Firstly, this argument depends on our intuitive assent to the idea that everything that exists has a cause. As I said, our experience of the world that we live in and that we inhabit is, common sense experience of it is that effects do have causes. Everything that we see does have a cause, and that is how things are. But the most we can say about our common sense is that it is true of the universe that we experience. So reality as we experience it today. That's all our common sense experience actually embraces. So when you're invited to assent to the proposition that everything must have a cause, every effect must have a cause, the very most you can say is that's true for as much as I know, for as much as I have experience of, for as much as the world that I see around me. Once we venture beyond the point, not just of that, but beyond the point of the universe itself, everything that exists, full stop, I think it's genuinely questionable as to whether we can claim that our common sense can embrace the conditions that were in place at that time, at the time before current reality existed. Once we venture beyond that point, I think there's absolutely no reason to believe that the same rules that apply here and now applied then. It's also wrong to say, as was said, that physics has demonstrated that the universe definitely began. Well, it's true that everything observable currently followed from the Big Bang, but that doesn't mean that there was nothing at the point immediately preceding it. The proposition this evening mentioned Roger Penrose, a physicist, mathematician actually, but who's made delves into theoretical physics, and his current model of the universe. And he's also a Nobel Prize winner, though I don't think that means we should necessarily believe what he says. I don't want to stand here and quote Nobel Prize winners at you as if they're somehow ultimately authoritative. But Roger Penrose happens also to be a Nobel Prize winner, and his model of the universe does not depend on there being one original first cause, quite the opposite. So there's no necessary reason to believe that science has demonstrated that the universe must have had a beginning, and there's no necessary reason from our experience of the world as we currently inhabit it that those same conditions must have pertained just before the universe began, and that therefore it must have a beginning. But on top of that, even if we were to believe that the universe had to have, as it were, a cause, I can't see any good reason to believe that that cause would have to be what we call a god. Certainly, even in the world that we inhabit now, one thing leads to another, but not every action has intention behind it. If I, happen to be gesticulating wildly to make my point as I'm speaking here to you, and as a result I knock, this jug of water onto the carpet, and a pool of water then results in this carpet, certainly my actions have led to the existence of a pool of water in the carpet, but that wasn't my intention. It was a pure byproduct of whatever action I was carrying out at the time, gesticulating in order to talk to you. A plant, take the example of a plant that grows and produces seeds, and then those seeds go out and other plants grow from those seeds. That, again, is a series of events, one thing leading to another, but there's no purpose behind it, there's no intention behind it. So even if we do think that there must have been one event that led to the universe, caused the universe right at the beginning of it, there's certainly no reason to believe that there was necessarily intention behind it. And there's certainly no reason to believe that even if there was, we can make a massive leap and say that that was a god that we might know anything about, or that might even still exist today. So even if we accept causation on what I'm saying, I suppose, even if we accept causation, causation doesn't necessarily mean agency, doesn't mean that there's purpose behind it. And really the whole argument of the first cause is a sort of attempt to exempt God from the normal rules of cause and effect, because it doesn't take very long to see how there's an inconsistency in the argument, even logically, which is that if every effect has a cause, then why should we even believe that at the very beginning there was a cause that had itself no cause? So the argument betrays pretty clearly its origins, which is specifically from the world of Islamic or Christian scholars who already believe in God, but are trying to find a way of rationalizing and demonstrating and justifying the belief that they already have. I don't think it makes any sense, if you don't believe in a God and are trying to be persuaded of the existence of one, to use that argument as if it somehow demonstrates anything. It really demonstrates nothing. The second argument that was made was a sort of version of an argument from design. It was about the fine-tuning of the universe. I don't really want to spend much time on this, apart from to say that it's rather obvious that the universe has all the conditions necessary to produce life, because we're here. That clearly is the case. But what's absolutely not demonstrable is that it had to be that way. Or that you can somehow reverse engineer this fact, again, to imply purpose and agency behind it. Douglas Adams had a very good analogy for the human belief that the universe was fine-tuned for the production of the amazing product that is us, which is a very vain thing to believe as well, at the same time as having no evidence to support it. And his analogy for this was, take the example of a puddle. Here is a puddle, we're back to this puddle, not this puddle there, but another puddle, say. So there's a puddle sitting in a hole, and the puddle looks about it, and it says, oh, it's so incredibly amazing. This hole is exactly the same shape as I am. Therefore, everything around me must have been created so that I could exist. This is fine-tuned, my environment is fine-tuned, calibrates to every aspect of my existence. Well, of course, that's not the case at all. The puddle is the shape of the hole because the puddle formed in the hole. That says nothing about the purpose behind the hole. The hole wasn't made for the puddle. The puddle was made because of the shape of the hole. And that's what we're like as living beings at this particular very short moment of time in the context of the universe. The origin of life. There was an argument advanced to you, not that individual species had to be separately created. That wasn't advanced, though it is sometimes advanced to defend the idea of God. But that the very origin of life itself, of biology, as it were, is so much of a complicated mystery that the only explanation for it must be that a designer engineered it. Lots of talk of mechanisms and sophistication, as if these terms had any prima facie meaning, which of course they don't. You can't really speak about mechanisms and sophistication unless you already assume that there's a mechanic behind it. So I think we should try and find words that don't make those sorts of presumptions and assumptions when we talk about this. It is true the structures of life are extremely complex, but the argument that they're extremely complex is surely no argument for the existence of a designer who must itself or himself or herself be even more complex if they're able to engineer such remarkably complex things themselves. That takes you nowhere. God is no explanation in that situation, because there must have obviously been some engineer of this God that engineered everything else. But there is no clear and total explanation currently of how life itself on this planet or elsewhere originated. Experiments are getting closer to the moment, to rehearsing and demonstrating the moment in the laboratory when life can begin. Certainly, we're now able to demonstrate that amino acids, which are the sort of the units that make up proteins, can be made in laboratory conditions, not by intention, but just by running simulated environments that might have existed at the point when amino acids first began in nature, as it were. And there are plenty of hypotheses for how life could have originated from these molecules. Again, we were one day to exhaust all the scientific investigation of this question, and please remember it's only been going on for 60 years, which is less than the lifetime of some people in this room, many people in this room, and is certainly a very small moment in the history of humanity, and an even smaller moment in the history of the universe. So even if it were the case that we were never able to precisely replicate or totally explain how very basic units can produce the complicated thing that is life that we see around us, there's absolutely no reason why you should invoke some divine explanation instead. And a lot of what you heard from the proposition, and it's true of what you heard about consciousness as well, is a sort of argument from ignorance. We don't know, therefore it must have been a divine force beyond our ken. But that's really not a good explanation for anything. Once upon a time, it looked as if the sun went round the earth, and we didn't know it didn't, and we didn't know where the sun came from. Now we know the sun doesn't go round the earth goes round the sun, and we begin to know more about how the sun might have, come to exist in the first place. So an argument from ignorance doesn't really get you anywhere. It certainly doesn't demonstrate, from nothing, the existence of a God. And I'm not going to spend much time responding to the argument about consciousness or free will on that basis, because I think the same thing applies to the argument about consciousness as applies to the argument about the origin of life. Although I have to say that I don't think that consciousness is a useless byproduct. I can see very clearly how the ability to plan and to see consequences, which consciousness allows us to have very great survival value and be very good in natural selection for our survival. So I don't think that the argument there was very strong. I'll come at the end now to moral values. And I found it difficult to quite follow this argument, but I'll try to respond to it by giving an account of moral values as I see them, and see where that gets us in the discussion as it proceeds. The argument as I read it was, if God does not exist, and it's a negative argument, so that's maybe why it's a bit tricksy, and I can't quite get a grip on it. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. That was the argument, I think, as we heard it rehearsed. Now, even assuming that the obvious alternatives to God are not in play here, and there's no reason to believe why some sophisticated other life forms might have made us on this earth and written into us certain moral ways of behaving. So, even if objective moral values do exist and they're in us, there's no reason to invoke God as an explanation of those, by the way. It could be aliens, as likely, in my mind, as God. But leaving that to one side... Oh, 1 minute. Oh, that's easy, fine. Leaving that 1 minute for morality, it's all you need. Leaving that aside, let's look more clearly at the claim that objective moral values exist. Because the claim that, what you've heard is supposed to shock you, basically. If someone says objective moral values don't exist, as I'm about to do, then you're meant to believe that that means that killing babies for fun is fine. Well, clearly, that's obviously not the case. The flaw in this argument is, however, with the claim that objective moral values exist. Now, clearly, morality is not subjective in the sense that it's something that every individual makes up for themselves, something that is grounded solely in the preferences of the individual human being. Clearly, we can tell from our own experience and from the study of other societies and societies back in time that this is not the case. But that does not mean that it has to come from a source outside of human beings collectively. So clearly it's not subjective in the sense that it's an individual matter of choice and preference, right? But that doesn't mean it has to come from a source outside of human beings collectively. Morality, yes, I'm going to do it. How many seconds have I got? 10? Morality is rooted in the human condition. It's grounded in what it is to be human, and being human is one thing that all of us have in common. The fact that we are social beings, that we have certain objective basic needs which are part of our nature, is itself enough to give the objectivity that was described to our moral values. And I've got much more to say about that, but I think because of the constraints of time, I'm going to have to say it in the 7 or 4 minutes, whatever the next bit of responding. So, you'll have to wait for at least 7 minutes before you find out how that's going to end. But I assure you it's an extremely persuasive argument.
Thank you, Andrew, for your contribution. I invite Richard to make his 7 minutes at the top. Rebuttal, please.
Well, I'm just going to have to concede. Andrew has absolutely demolished the rain god and the dung beetle god. If any of you believed in those, I think he's completely refuted them, that they're finished. But I think this idea of religious beliefs arising from the natural world, I think that's a good explanation, possibly, of the origin of pagan religions. It doesn't fit at all with, for example, Christianity, where the start of the story is with an encounter with God and going on from there. But whatever you believe about that, it's just a classic logical fallacy. It's the genetic fallacy. It's trying to discredit a belief because of the way people came to arrive at that belief. But that's not a good reason to reject a belief. People can have bad reasons to believe something, but it still can be true. So you've got to look at the best reasons there are and assess those. Andrew said there's a universe, and so you think someone must have put it there. That obviously, it's not even a simplification of my argument. It's just a caricature of the argument that I put forward. Now, as I explained in my opening talk, what I was talking about was based on scientific advances, not on ignorance of science. Now, Andrew then went on to say people produce gods in their own image, like us. I'm not sure how that fits in with the rain god and the dung beetle god. So I think there might have been a contradiction there. But if God's created in our image, I don't think I'm all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect, and omnipresent. So I think certainly the God I believe in wasn't created in the image of people. Now, the parallels that Andrew drew were to do with God being personal, having emotions, etc. I mean, one explanation for that could be that people made up God in their image. Another explanation could be that God made people in his image. Andrew asserted that the people's conservative, liberal values, etc., don't change because of their religious faith. I would present myself as a counterexample to that. I would be quite conservative-minded normally, but there's some of my beliefs, moral values that would be seen as very liberal or very left-wing as well with regard to economics, for example. The idea about parents, again, it's the genetic fallacy. Where a belief comes from has nothing to do with whether it's true or not. Again, Andrew talked about the fact that people's beliefs about religion change over time. Again, so what? I mean, scientific beliefs change over time. It doesn't mean that any one of them is true or false. You've got to look at the arguments on their own merits. The idea of the evolution of religions through Mithraism, etc. Andrew mentioned a few other ones as well. Mithraism, the parallels normally cited for Mithraism are just untrue. If you look at the actual original documents about Mithraism, it isn't there. It's something that's been made up, circulates on YouTube and on the internet, and often is quoted by atheists. Even if there's a parallel, which there isn't in the case of Mithraism, even if there's a parallel, if there's no way that one could have influenced the other, if they're in different ages in different places, then there's still no connection. So I think a lot of what Andrew talked about was specific ideas about God, whereas the topic tonight is there a God? Just to give you an analogy, if the topic tonight was, is there a person who puts presents under the Christmas tree? A lot of what Andrew said has been along the lines of, I don't believe in Santa. Okay, he's been dealing with specific conceptions of God rather than the actual concept of God in itself. Right, responding to some of the responses to my arguments, I was astounded to hear Andrew question the causal principle to suggest that things can happen with no cause. I mean, if that's the case, that really is the end of science, isn't it? Could you imagine someone producing a scientific paper, say, I've looked into this, and I just think it happens, and it sort of just does, and that's it. There's nothing else to say. Okay, surely the causal principle is so fundamental that we can't even contemplate rejecting that. I think Andrew, a couple of times, talking about the Big Bang, he talked about what preceded it, the time before it. Obviously, time came into being at the Big Bang, so I think they are contradictory statements. The idea that there are different rules, that the causal principle didn't apply before, there's no before the Big Bang. Again, I think that's the wild, wild philosophical speculation to suggest that things can happen with no cause at all. And Roger Penrose's alternative explanation, I mean, he presents that himself as extremely speculative, and there are lots of others as well. But even if you decide that some of the mathematical speculations that have been come up with to try and talk about what might have led to the Big Bang or whatever, Big Bang might have been a sequence of other events, even if you accept those, in 2003, three scientists produced something called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin singularity theorem, which proved that no matter what model of universes, multiverses, sequences of universes, no matter what model you go for, it must have a beginning. And in any case, I basically presented two philosophical arguments at the start, and the philosophical arguments still haven't been answered. Now, Andrew said, even if you think there must be a cause of the universe, why think it's God? Well, I'd invite you to think about what the alternatives could be for something that's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and was not itself caused to exist by anything in that sort of physical sense, and also is outside time. I mean, you might be able to think up other things, but I can't think of any apart from God. Now, Andrew came up with the idea of where did God come from? How was God created? I think God is outside time. When you're outside time, the idea of coming into being, of being created, doesn't have any application. So I think that's a non-question. With fine-tuning, Andrew responded by saying, oh, well, it's not amazing because we're here, and so because we're here, it must be the way it is. That's a bit like saying, if you're on an aeroplane, and you said to the person next to you, I'm thinking aeroplanes are amazing. How do they stay in the sky? They said, well if they didn't stay in the sky, we'd be dead, wouldn't we? So we wouldn't be here discussing it. Would that be the end of the conversation? Of course you wouldn't. You'd still want to know why the aeroplane managed to keep you alive. Right, origin of life. Words like mechanism and sophisticated, you saw what was on there. If Andrew objects to that being called a mechanism or being called a machine, well, I just think they're the obvious words to use. The inference to design is not based on a gap in knowledge. We make inferences to design all the time. When you go to Stonehenge, you don't look at it and think, oh, I wonder if that just arose naturally, or I wonder if that needed designing. Okay, you interpret things that you see every day, and you look at their features, and you correctly infer design. I look at what goes on in the cell, and I infer design, not because of what I don't know, but because of what I do know about it. the laboratory demonstrations of the formation of some basic biological compounds in the 1950s, and since they're absolutely trivial compared to creating life. It's like saying we managed to make a bit of rubber and a bit of steel, so we think cars could have risen by chance. Yeah, that's the sort of gap that there is. Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Finding yourself in the universe and trying to understand the universe is nothing like being on an aeroplane. It's absolutely nothing like being on an aeroplane at all. If you're on an aeroplane, you know why you're there. You're trying to get from one place to another. You know already, firstly, that someone has built that aeroplane and that it operates to, laws and principles that have human intentions behind them. When you find yourself in the universe, you cannot make that assumption. And so to imply, by an analogy like that, that the same thing that you might say when you say, why is this aeroplane going from here to there? How is it doing it? It's the same as you might say, why is the universe as it is? It's simply untrue. You heard how I'm guilty of logical fallacies. Well, I'll address that in a moment. But certainly the argument that you've just heard is guilty of deeply flawed analogies. And I think that it's unreliable for that reason. I haven't got much more to say in response to the idea of the first cause other than what I've said. I don't see why I don't see how the concept of timelessness makes sense in the absence of time. I don't see how the concept of spacelessness makes sense in the absence of space. And I don't see how the concept of immaterialness, or immateriality, I suppose would be the word, makes sense in the absence of matter. So I simply can't engage with the idea, that's a lot of big words, right, which essentially are meaningless when you come to consider the origin of the universe. I simply can't engage with that idea, apart from to say that it doesn't solve the argument that I made to say that even if there is such a force, then action doesn't imply intention. So even if you were to go so far as to say there must be such a force that gave the universe its beginning, there's still absolutely no reason based on that argument why there should have been any intention behind the action that gave the universe its beginning. In terms of responding to the claim that a logical fallacy has been made in my argument about the reasons why human beings invent gods and how gods bear the mark of human manufacture, I want to just say this. When you're arguing in a discussion like this or trying to find out what's true, let's pretend that we're here together trying to find out what's true, and that our discussion here is actually an attempt to reach some truth rather than the defence of already held positions and their justification. If we are going to do that, it's not a zero-sum game in every argument that is made. One argument may be better than another, but it may not yet be true and right, absolutely convincingly, right? A claim can be more reasonable than another claim. It's not the case that everything is either logical and therefore true, or illogical and therefore untrue. Let me give you an example. Okay, so a good example of a logical conclusion that is nonetheless untrue is the idea that I can levitate into the air. Why is that logical? Well, let me tell you. Here are two premises which are the case, okay? All people called Andrew can levitate. I am a person called Andrew, therefore I can levitate. Ruthlessly logical, that claim, and the conclusion that follows from it, as you can see, but totally untrue, because the premises that lie behind it have no reality, have no basis in reality. So it's very easy to make logical arguments, like, for example, everything must have a cause, the universe is something, therefore the universe must have had a cause. But unless you're sure of the premises, unless the premises are absolutely sound, that ruthless logic doesn't necessarily indicate truth. So let's get away from the idea that either a claim is logical and true or illogical and therefore untrue. And I'll deal briefly with the idea that I'm guilty of a fallacy grandly named the genetic fallacy. So the idea was, I said, we can judge that gods are likely to be human creations because they look like they're human creations, they change over time, they bear the stamps of human manufacture, and there's variety amongst them that corresponds to the variety of human societies that produce them. Okay? The opposition to that was that it was essentially a claim that a bad reason to believe something made the thing that was believed not true. But I wasn't claiming that, and so I wasn't guilty of a fallacy. I'm not saying that absolutely, certainly 100%, because we can see all those things that I've said are true of gods are true of them, therefore they don't exist. I'm saying that it's a persuasive reason. It's a persuasive argument. It's a more reasonable argument than the idea that there is a God that is transcendent and accessible to us universally. I think it's a more reasonable claim that actually different ideas of God are human creations. I'm not saying that it's definitely the case, but I'm saying that it's a reasonable claim, and more reasonable than the alternative, which is that somehow there's a God, or one specific one in the minds of most believers. And I want to say, could you tell me how much time I've got left? A minute and a half, okay, well then you're going to have to wait yet further for the conclusion of the moral argument. Because I do want to respond also to this idea that we're here to be discussing God, rather than individual gods, and say the arguments that I've made about individual gods are somehow irrelevant. People believe in a specific God. That is largely what people who say they believe in God and belong to a religion believe in. So to try and get out of the obligation that anyone who wants to advance an idea about a particular God has, which is that they should demonstrate that there are good reasons to believe in this specific God that they believe in, to try and get out of that by invoking grand principles about God generally simply won't do, right? Not all of the arguments about God or justifications for God that have been advanced by the proposition, for example, are true of all gods. They're very distinctively true of the God that many Christians believe in and the God that many Muslims believe in, but they're not distinctive of all ideas of God. So I think that it's fair enough to focus on individual gods as one of the things that we need to talk about. And I can't just give you the historical and social cause of the dung beetle God. I could give you the social cause of the Jesus Christ model of God, if you want, based on the very fascinating meeting of Romano-Greek and Jewish culture in the Middle East almost 2,000 years ago, but based even more so on the politics of exclusion in the Roman world, based on previous stories of scapegoating, based on politics, you know, the divinity of...
Can I ask you to finish the sentence you started? You've got examination.
I will finish my sentence. Thank you. Based on the... Oh, you know me already. Okay. Based on, you know, politics, the divinity of Jesus Christ, for example, being determined quite a few centuries after, if he ever lived, he's supposed to have died. So, I mean, all these ideas about God are products of society. And it doesn't just explain the dung beetle God, it explains the Christian God, and explains it very well. I'm not saying that, therefore, it's not true, but I'm saying it's a more reasonable explanation than that somehow God exists.
Before we move to the opportunity for you to ask questions from the floor, I'm going to invite each of our speakers now to rebuttals and to speak for 4 minutes each, maximum. Richard first, thank you.
Just returning to the moral argument, first of all, Andrew suggested the possibility of aliens putting moral values in us. I think maybe you think that's a live option. It hasn't gone much further than that so far. With consciousness, Andrew tried to suggest that my argument was we don't understand consciousness, therefore God must have done it. It wasn't that. My main point was that consciousness is not a physical thing, therefore it can have no physical effects. So consciousness does not help us to plan, and it's not intelligence. Okay, you can have as much intelligence with a computer, it can follow through a logical system, make intelligent decisions without consciousness. The consciousness does not contribute to that process. Right, the idea of the aeroplane, Andrew objected to that. I think he picked up on some irrelevant features of the analogy. But just to use another one, if you imagine that you were sentenced to death by a firing squad, there were 20 people, and they all fired their guns, and you suddenly found that you were alive, you were still there. Okay? I believe Andrew would say to himself, well, there's nothing to be surprised about, because if they'd shot me, I wouldn't be here. so nothing needs explaining. Whereas I think I would say, hang on, what's happened? Something strange going on here. They must have missed on purpose. Someone must have put blanks in the guns. It would need explaining. Andrew said he can't comprehend timelessness. Okay, it is a difficult thing to understand, but that's the findings of science, that time had a beginning. I also gave the philosophical argument that time had a beginning. So Andrew might find it hard to comprehend, but I'm willing to follow the conclusions of the arguments. Action doesn't imply intention, Andrew said, with regard to the origin of the universe. Possibly, but I still think the evidence points to a supernatural cause of the universe. I mean, if God created the universe by accident, then yes, my argument would equally well support that hypothesis, if any of you are interested in adopting that one. The genetic fallacy, I pointed out that. I think Andrew denied that he was making it, but then I think he continued to make it. He described what he was saying as an argument against the existence of God. The fact that people believe in God for bad reasons somehow undermines the idea that God exists. But you've got to assess whether God exists by looking at the best arguments for it, not looking at bad arguments that people have had. Again, Andrew tried to justify his focus on specific ideas of God rather than the actual topic of the debate, which is the existence of God in general. I still think my Santa analogy holds. I'm saying there's someone who puts presents under the Christmas tree, and Andrew's saying it's not Santa, it's not the tooth fairy, it's not this, that, and the other, but that's not the topic of the debate tonight. Now, Andrew suggested that he could explain the origin of Christianity by socio-historical theories, etc. Again, very interesting topic, but it's not the topic of tonight's debate. I'm happy to come back another time and have that debate. But tonight's debate is about the general concept of God. Now, Andrew suggested that's quite an ill-defined concept. But I think we're talking about an all-powerful, supernatural, personal, good, omnipotent, omniscient being. Okay, that's what I'm talking about, is the general idea of God. The arguments I've presented have been arguments for the existence of such a being. And I think all the other things about specific gods are just a red herring, and I'm unwilling to be drawn into discussing those. Okay, thank you.
As to whether or not the idea of a specific God or gods in general is the focus of the topic, I think I've said all I can say about that, which is that I reject the idea that real people in real life have a generic idea about the existence of, a God. Real people in the real world believe in specific gods, and so that's all I think it makes sense for us to talk about. The firing squad analogy is another analogy. Reasoning by analogy, or trying to draw conclusions by analogy, is not very good way to arrive at truth. Again, clearly what is wrong with the analogy is that the people with the guns, you know that they're human beings, you know that they have intentions already, so when they don't shoot you, having pulled their triggers, you can make conclusions because you already know that they are forces with intentions, with feelings, with motivations. You already have that information. That's not a direct analogy for our finding ourselves in the universe. We don't already know that it's not the situation that we already know that the universe must have a purpose, and therefore the question is simply, what is the purpose? It's that we don't even know that the universe does have a purpose, and so the question is there any good reason to believe that it does? We can't start halfway through the argument. Very quickly on consciousness, the claim exactly, I think, word for word, because I wrote it down, I think. Consciousness is not a physical thing, therefore it can have no physical effects. Therefore it can't be useful. Well, I think that's manifestly untrue. Consciousness exists in the human mind, and its effects are on human bodies, real human bodies in the here and now, which behave in ways different from how they would behave if there wasn't consciousness in us. And so clearly a human body that has consciousness within it will behave in a different way from the body of an animal that does not. And if that gives a survival advantage, which it does, I think, in the ways that I discussed earlier, then of course it can have an effect on natural selection and on evolution as a result. In terms of and I don't find the arguments difficult to understand, as was charmingly put to you just now, and therefore difficult to comprehend. I just find them empty. I find them, without basis because there's no reason to accept them, not because I somehow am of limited capacity and can't quite grasp the complex matters at hand. The moral argument which I want to come back to, I was suspended in the middle of responding to the original argument at the point where I was saying that we need to distinguish morality as being objective in the sense that it is independent of the views and feelings of individual subjective human beings. We need to distinguish that idea from the idea that morality has to emanate from and be backed by some kind of authority, okay? And I think that it's pretty clear, if you think about it, that if you believe that morality emanates from some sort of authority, that doesn't actually help you to make morality objective. It makes it subjective, because morality, on that argument, depends on whatever that particular authority wants. You know, the authority, God in this case, could have written the moral rules differently. And many attempts to ground morality in the authority of a divine figure are highly changeable. One minute gods say do something, and the next minute they say do the opposite thing in a totally different context. And you can see in the history of even the religions that are still around these changes in moral values occurring. And so since that's the case, I think we have to look at morality in naturalistic terms, and we can begin to understand it if we look at our closest relatives in the animal world, other primates. We can see the beginnings of morality as the social instincts, and we can see that what we as conscious beings now call morality as an organised social attempt to reinforce those social instincts that we have. So millennia of culture, based on a biological origin in the form of social instincts, I think is a sufficient explanation of the origin of morality. And the fact that we're human beings living in societies with each other and generate obligations to each other in our dealings with each other is sufficient. Morality is an artifact of humanity. If every human being ceased to exist tomorrow, morality would cease to exist too, because we're the carriers of it, we're the doers of it. It's something that resides and is generated by us with each other. It's not objective in the sense that it's external and transcendent. That actually demeans morality. Thank you very much. No, I don't know.
We'll move on now to your opportunity to ask questions of our speakers, of Richard and/or Andrew. May I remind you, please, that you are asking questions, not making a speech. And may I also remind you that the questions you ask should pertain to the topic that we're discussing this evening, which is there a God? So with those two provisos, could I just ask you to ask questions in that context? Is there anybody who would like to do that? In order to ask a question, I would invite you to come to the microphone when I've invited you, and to speak from the microphone just in front of VJ there, so that everyone can hear the question you are asking. The gentleman on the front row here with the purple top, would you like to open the batting, please? To whom is the question addressed first as well, please?
Yeah, the question is for Richard. You were talking about Roger Penrose and his theories, which you said are extremely speculative. You didn't mention that there is actually evidence for his come up in the cosmic microwave background radiation. So therefore, I think there's very good reason that at the moment, hypothesis could explain a cyclical universal structure. If it's cyclical, it's infinite. If it's infinite, it doesn't matter how unlikely something is, it will happen. And it will happen again and again and again and again.
Can you just clarify your question then, please?
So the question is, would you concede that that explanation or that hypothesis it's not a theory yet, could explain the fine-tuning?
Right, I heard Roger Penrose talking about his theory recently, and he advanced it very modestly and describing it as extremely speculative still. But if you have the idea, you're saying a circle of causation, a cycle. Is that what you're saying?
Well, his book's called Cycles in Time.
Yeah.
Therefore,
So
put it briefly, we know the universe is expanding. The expansion is actually speeding up. We thought it would be slowing down or collapse into it. It's speeding up. What his hypothesised is that there will come a point where space-time is so dissipated it cannot hold the structure. It will collapse into a singularity. The whole cycle starts again.
That still doesn't address that. But so the Borg-Kurzweil-Lenken singularity theorem says no matter what model you have to have a beginning.
Why?
You need to look at the proof that they've come up with.
So you can't answer that. You say someone else knows that.
But if you look at the philosophical...
I want to know why you say that, why you agree with them. If you can't tell me why, that's true.
But the philosophical argument is to do with one thing cause another, and there having to be a start of the chain of causation.
Why?
So
Why?
just let me finish.
Okay.
So even if one of these wildly speculative ideas about multiple universes, etc., even if one of those was right, it still leaves the philosophical argument there about the first cause.
I totally disagree.
Would you like to add anything, Andrew?
Well, yeah. Oh, do we stay where we are? Yeah, I mean, I'll stand up. I would merely add that I agree with what's implicit in the question, which is that if there is a model available, as Roger's model is, which does not depend on a first cause, then the argument that there must be a first cause clearly fails. And it's not enough to say, but philosophically there must be a first cause, because at that point you're saying, I can somehow overcome an argument that's based on the evidence of the universe as we see it, and modelling based on that evidence, in the case of Roger's evidence, with my own reason that tells me that this can't be the case, it can't, because. So I think that the problem is that, the problem for this side of the argument, I mean, is that there is actually a model that explains how we got here, as it were, how the universe got here now, which does not depend on a first cause, and which has evidence to support it. And Roger when he drew it for me anyway, he drew a sort of, like a cone. It's very difficult, obviously. I mean, extremely difficult to talk about the beginning of the universe. I mean, can you think of a more obscure topic? Something that we should be more agnostic about is difficult to think of. But the fact that a theory does exist for which there's evidence, which doesn't require a cause, is a problem for the blanket argument that there should be a cause, obviously.
The thing I would re-emphasise is that this is not accepted science. It's not even close to it. Okay, this is a mathematical speculation. There are various other speculations like that, but again, it doesn't address the core point of my argument.
Second question, can you go to the microphone, please?
I don't want to talk about dung beetles, but I just mention lions, if I may, to Andrew. I mean, you're talking about lions might have an image of God, but I think the image refers to the fact that we have intelligence, that when we're in God's image, that means that we think, I think. And models, well, you can have lions, if they take over pride, they'll immediately eat the young, so, you know, that's the sort of models they've got. In terms of the last point that was made, I'd just like to talk about entropy, increasing disorder, and that to me is, rather than cyclical, suggests the universe is running down because of increasing entropy.
Have you got a question, Dan?
And disorder.
Have you got a question?
That's the question about, sorry, the question really was about how can lions, well, he's misunderstanding, I think Andrew is misunderstanding about being in the image of God.
Well, is there a question for you to answer that?
Yes, I mean, it's not me, it's Xenophanes I was quoting, who, you know, that quote is from Xenophanes about 2,500 years ago, who was a Greek philosopher. And by this analogy, he was attempting to make the point that we make images of gods, you know, societies. When we look around the world, we see different societies that have different ideas of gods. Take it as a very basic example. People who have different skin colours draw their image of God with different skin colours as a consequence. But so too do people who have different societies draw their image of God in different ways. And Xenophanes is trying to make that point in a semi-comical way by reference to the animal world, to say, of course we think that gods look like us, and if we were horses or lions or cattle, we'd think that gods looked like horses or lions or cattle. That's the argument. It's got nothing to do with the morals of lions, which I'm not qualified to speak about the morals of lions.
That's another thing that you meant.
Yes.
Now for myself, when I say the image of God, I don't see God as a person, be black or white.
Yes.
That's my own view.
The only thing I'd say is I feel I've already explained why I think that discussion is not relevant to the topic.
There's a lady at the back, student, I think. Would you like to come to the microphone so we can hear you, please? Thank you.
Hi, this question goes out to a proposition, or Richard. You seem to pit a lot of your arguments based on the fine-tuning of the universe, but what is so incomprehensible about us being one possibility out of many? For example, using your example of DNA, although we are nitrogen-based DNA, we recently found bacteria with arsenic-based DNA, and so that doesn't mean that alternatives are any less valid than what we have now. So how does that mean that we're necessarily designed?
Okay, but when you say one of many, would you mean one of many universes?
No, I just meant one of many possibilities.
One of many possible life forms.
In the statistics with the many zeros that you quoted.
Right. When I'm talking about the possibility of life, some of the fine-tuning is not to do with just having the right sort of chemical sort of, it's having any sort of chemistry at all. It's having a universe that lasts more than a fraction of a second. Or that there's any possibility of matter coming together in ways where you could form any sort of molecules. So a lot of the fine-tuning is not to do with life, being able to have life just like us. It's been able to have any possible conception of any form of life at all in the universe. So I think the claims of fine-tuning are broader than maybe you were thinking.
Could there have been like infinite collisions of matter before life actually happened?
No, because I think that would contradict. I think the universal probability band gives the limit on the number of events that could have happened in the history of the universe. So no, I don't think there could have been an infinite number of chemical interactions hoping to create life.
Just going to ask Andrew to respond to your question. Thank you.
All I can say is very briefly, I agree again with the argument that's implicit behind what you're saying, which is that the fine-tuning argument depends on the non-argument, that we are here because things are as they are, and therefore things must be as they are so that we can be here, which is absolutely, there's no good reason to believe that's true at all.
Okay, thank you. This lady here, and I'm going to take the gentleman with the blue pullover after that.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I've listened and hoped you would mention the word goddess. I have in this life heard God, God, God. Now, I bought this recently. My husband and I divorced over religious differences. He thought he was God and I didn't. Now, the previous lady of Chinese origin, they talk about yin and yang. So, gentlemen, would you accept this concept? When Adam delved, what did he do? She was weaving ideas. There's a recent book being published on emotional intelligence. I'm sick of male intellect, which is sterile. Rethink some of the ideas and move forward to the year 2020. I actually have been in an existence of timelessness with a man.
May I ask what your question is then? Your point.
The question is again, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?
Right, okay. Andrew.
Well, it's undeniable that for many people all over the world, and certainly in the past as well, goddesses have been just as important as gods, and you can see why that should be. The worship of the goddess Isis lasted twice as long as Christianity has lasted so far, until it finally faded away. So, if it has faded away, maybe it's still going on, I don't know. But certainly it lasted a very long time. And I think that the existence of both gods and goddesses, again, comes back to the origin of gods and religions as reflecting very much the way that human beings see the world, the balance that they see in the world, the fertility that you see in the world, the codependence of the sexes that you see in the world, is certainly one of the things that generated gods and goddesses in observable human history and in observable human societies. I mean, I can't say that I hope for a return of goddess worship, because I don't hope for any particular growth in the worship of anything, but I certainly sympathise with the point.
I would say all the arguments I've put forward tonight could equally apply to a goddess as to a god. But I think the whole conversation is, it's like, to use my Santa analogy again, the topic is there a person who puts presents under the Christmas tree? And we're now talking about, is Santa a man or a woman? So I think, again, it's not
Gentleman with the blue pullover, please.
Question for Andrew. DNA, 7 billion of us have got different DNA code, plus all the animals. Can you explain why?
No.
Succinct and to the point.
I would say you can go further than that. There are some things we can't explain, but as I said, if you saw Stonehenge, you might not know exactly how it was made, but you can still look at something and know whether it involved intelligent input or whether it was just a natural phenomena that arose without intelligent input. So not being able to explain something is fair enough, but you can often go beyond that. You can look at the nature of the thing and see whether it's going to be amenable to a naturalistic explanation or whether it needs intelligent input to be created.
Gentleman with a pink shirt, reddish pink. No,
I've got a question rather than a speech to Andrew. On the moral values question, I know you were cut short, but I got the impression that you thought morality wasn't objective or subjective, but was to do with what humans agree as kind of a social construct. My question would be, so is morality whatever humanity or a group of humans together can agree it to be?
No, that's not what I was saying. I was actually denying that the opposition between subjective and objective that you just put up is actually true, that they're the only two options that we have. What I said was that morality wasn't objective in the sense that it was drawn from a source external to human beings generally and collectively, but that it wasn't subjective in the sense that it was simply the preferences and beliefs and inclinations of individual human beings. Clearly, what objectivity morality has arises out of human nature and experience. And we clearly have objectively the same basic needs. We clearly have objectively social instincts as a result of our evolution. We have today various very complicated moral ideas like international justice, or, sex equality, right, which is not an immediately obvious idea, but it's quite a complicated one. And those ideas are the product of human development over time. And so I think that what objectivity morality has derives from what we have in common as human beings, and not from some sort of external source. And I don't believe that the consequence of that is that morality is subjective. I mean, but then we're possibly using the words in different ways. I certainly disagree with the two possible concepts that you put out there.
Richard?
I would say what Andrew's doing is trying to offer a mix of evolutions, society, reason, and not quite being clear exactly which one it is, but you look at one, then you dot around to another, as if somehow between them they can give some sort of moral objectivity. I think in my opening speech I explained why each of those just completely fail to account for objective moral values. Now, it's a challenge for Andrew. I challenge Andrew to give any basic moral principle that if I keep saying to him why, he doesn't get to the stage where he just says, I just know that that's right. Because that's the case with all of us. We've got moral beliefs that we're absolutely confident in, and we can't explain them. We just know. It's intuition.
What's that got to do with anything?
the point
What's
is
that got to do with God? And quite apart from that, what's it got to do with what we're talking about now, which is moral values?
The point is that we regard those intuitions as authoritative, and there's no reason to do that if they're not God-given. If they're just a product of evolution or whatever, then we're not obliged to follow them.
I mean, I simply can't believe that the only reason why we would not rape someone would be because God had told us not to, and that there was an authoritative principle behind the universe. I just simply can't believe that that's the case.
That's not my argument.
Well, I mean, your argument is a mix. You said that my argument was a mixture of two principles. In fact, it wasn't. What I was talking about was morality as having at its foundation a biological origin in our social instincts, but having been embellished and built upon by human development. Now, that is not unusual. The same is true of food. Okay? The need to ingest food in order to live, and the need to space out eating is absolutely objectively part of our character. It's part of human nature. It's part of what we have evolved to be. But breakfast and lunch and dinner parties and all the cultural edifice that goes on top of the taking in of food is human culture, is human creation. Surely it's not difficult to see how some things that we experience as human beings can be part biological and part cultural. And I'm saying that morality is like that. Same is true of sex. I mean, the need, reproducing. All right. You can imagine for yourselves how the same is true of sex.
Just say very quickly, I did issue a bit of a challenge to Andrew for him to come up with a moral principle, and I'll keep asking him why he thinks that, and let's see where we can get to. So if Andrew wants to accept that challenge at any point, we can...
I'm rejecting the basis of your idea, though, so why would I accept a fake challenge that I don't believe in the basis of?
Okay, let's move on from that. That's this guy over there with the white shirt. You can come to the microphone, please.
Hi, I'd just like to say that was a great debate, but I'm not going to pick sides here. I'm just going to bring up one of the main contentions I found. One of the main clashes in this debate was that I think Richard said that I think there is a supernatural cause, but offered no explanation as to why or whether this is a personal choice or rather having some grounding evidence. I think it's really beneficial or detrimental to his case as to bring up evidence as to why he thinks that it's a supernatural cause and not what Andrew says that, oh, it might be another cause. I just think it's more reasonable. Yeah, that's the question.
Okay. So you're asking whether, to carry on about the supernatural cause, to clarify that?
Why he believes it is a supernatural cause.
Okay, thank you.
Right, because it needs to be something that fit my description of timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and itself on cause. Now, if you can come up with anything that to me is the definition of supernatural. It's something beyond physical, the physical realm, if you like. And again, coming back to the regressive causes, again, you've got to get to something that's outside the physical realm of one thing causing another. So the personhood of it doesn't follow directly from that particular argument. Okay? But I think a supernatural cause does follow from the argument.
Okay, thank you. We've talked quite a lot about the cause. Gentleman with the spectacles there. Yes, thank you.
Talking about sort of supernatural things, I'd like to ask Richard why he thinks that consciousness doesn't have a physical reality. I'm a neurologist. It's so obvious that it's a very complex function of brain activity. Why do you think it has no physical?
Well, I'm delighted to be asked that because I wanted to talk about that earlier on to answer Andrew. You may, I'm not saying this is what I believe, but you may believe that consciousness is just a result of the physical activity of the brain. Your brain follows the laws of physics, electrochemical machine, and somehow it gives rise to a consciousness. But consciousness is not a physical thing. My experience of seeing you sitting in front of me...
I asked you why you think it's not a physical thing.
My experience of seeing you sitting in front of me, you can't open up my brain and find that in there. It's something that's non-physical. And my point was, again, I think Andrew, when Andrew responded to it, it wasn't to exactly this point. My point is that consciousness itself is a non-physical thing. Therefore, a non-physical thing can't affect the brain. The brain produces the non-physical consciousness but the non-physical consciousness can't have an effect on the physical brain. That would be supernatural, wouldn't it?
Well,
if a non-physical thing...
This is a circular argument.
So hang on. So the reason...
Just hang on to speak, please.
It's a circular argument. You're saying it's starting off by saying it's something, ineffable, and therefore it can't be explained as a physical system. It's just a circular argument. If I might say that consciousness is deeply rooted into the brain, you can actually determine which parts of the brain serve the function of consciousness. You can remove some parts of the brain and consciousness is not lost. Yeah. Other parts you can see consciousness working on functional MRI scans.
But do you agree that the action...
There's a physical presence.
But do you agree that the physical activity in the brain is not the consciousness is a non-physical thing that is produced by the brain? Do you not agree? Do you think the consciousness is a physical thing?
I think it's
so you think your experience of
it's
tasting
an epiphenomenon of neural activity. It's a very impressive one, yes.
But it's non-physical.
Just like when you experience beauty or have some other mental experience. They're grounded in brain activity.
They're grounded in. But if you say experience of beauty, so your experience of beauty is a physical thing. So somewhere in your brain is a physical thing that is your experience of beauty.
And there are certain parts of the brain which, if damaged, you lose your ability to experience beauty. And
there are
other parts of your brain which, if damaged, you lose your appreciation of spirituality.
I've said what I've got to say on that, I think.
Thank you.
Agree to disagree.
Gentleman who's operating the camera. Standing behind it.
Question for Andrew. You talked about basically gods having a human origin. We have constructed gods around us. My question to you is based on a few events that have happened in the news this week. So we look at the death of Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan decision to basically embalm the body and preserve it so that people can go and visit that. My question to you is, why does the human nature or humanity have a part of human nature is to worship? We have an inspiration towards worship something, and if we remove God from the equation, we replace that with a human being. So in the case of Hugo Chavez, if you go again to the Lenin Mausoleum and in other communist societies where they've removed God, I can then bring that to the celebrity culture of the world around us, in that when we replace God from we look to human beings as something to worship. You talked about, our friend with the glasses, you talked about if you remove part of the brain, the appreciation of spirituality goes. So actually part of our physical brain makeup, there is part of our brain which is designed to worship. And I'm going to anticipate your response.
Well, what's your question first?
So okay, yeah, I'll let you respond then. My question is, why do you think it appears that human beings are part of their nature is to worship?
Well, I'm unlike the last gentleman. I am not someone whose field of study is the brain, so I can't answer your question. I mean, you need to ask someone whose field of study is the brain, so maybe he can answer our question. But I would question your claim that it is instinctive to all human beings to worship something. I mean, there are many human beings who don't feel that sense of reverence for an external thing. So I don't think that your claim is true. And if it does have an answer, if your question does have an answer, why? What is it about the human brain that generates these feelings of reverence and worship? I'm not the person to answer it because I'm not a student of the human brain.
You suggested you might have a secondary.
Okay, yeah.
That response. Is that the response you thought you'd get?
No, it wasn't. But
Sorry. What do you think I was going to say?
You claimed that many people don't worship.
Yes.
That they don't revere it. Actually, one of the humanist people that I was speaking to as they came in said that they came because you were here.
Yes.
Basically, they came because he said it's not often you get a name come to Oswestry. I'm sorry to quote you without asking, but it's not often you get a name come to Oswestry. So unfortunately, I would question that view that actually we all bring up heroes. So if we take God out of the equation, we do bring in worship for human beings, whether we view it as the deity or not.
Yeah, I find it difficult for you to make a claim about billions of humanity based on one conversation with one person that you've just met this evening. I mean, I think that the idea, there are billions of people throughout time and over the world right now who do not feel that sort of worship. And if you really think that the worship of a god, of this amazing force that we've just been hearing about is analogous to wanting to come and see me give a talk, then I question whether that is the same sort of feeling that you're saying it is.
Richard? My view is that within everyone there is some sort of awareness of God. That's not something I would use as an argument to try and convince a skeptic, but I do actually believe that we do have that in us. Just to follow up on Andrew's the point about Andrew's fame and prominence, I said to Andrew before we started, Richard Dawkins sometimes refuses to debate people because he says it would look better on their CV than on mine. I'm glad that Andrew doesn't take the same approach. So.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back who's, I was going to say hair's not dissimilar to mine. Oh, jeez.
It's a question for both of you. Thanks for the presentation of the arguments and rebuttals. Do both of you think it will ever be possible to prove objectively and conclusively that God does or does not exist? Or does it in the end come down to a progressive pathway based on reasoned faith and experience?
Well, I think I tried to make clear at the beginning, at least, that what I thought about the idea of proving that something doesn't exist, which is that I think it's, an endless job in a sense. And we know from the history of claims about God that if you wanted to try and prove something doesn't exist, you end with a very slippery opponent because, God is walking amongst us 1 minute, and then when we've explained everything around us, God disappears to the top of the mountain. And when we get to the top of the mountain, God disappears up into heaven. And when we get through our own sky out into the universe, God disappears into the gap between particles, or the moment just before the universe began. And so it's very difficult to try and prove that something doesn't exist because, the terms of a debate are always changing. I can't say whether or not anyone would ever be able to prove that there is a God. Because I haven't heard all the arguments yet. I mean, I hear the same arguments quite often in the course of my work, and none of those has ever persuaded me. But I can, that there might theoretically be ways that, persuasion could occur. I can't think of any off the top. I mean, I suppose if reality were to be rent asunder right now, and all of a sudden, you would see a miracle and God would appear, I suppose that might be, conclusive once we'd eliminated the alternative explanations. But that's really all I can say.
I don't think I'd say. I think proof's obviously an extremely demanding standard, and I think there's virtually nothing that we can actually prove. I think that it's possible that God could reveal himself in a way that would mean that every rational person would have to accept his existence. I think at the moment that's not the case, but I think that could be the case in the future. So will we ever reach the stage where God's existence is proved? If God decides to reveal himself in that type of way, then yes.
Thank you. I'm going to close the questions from the floor. I'm sorry that I'm sure there are other people who want to ask things, but if we're going to keep to the time limit of 9 o'clock, working back from that, and we really ought to invite Richard and Andrew to make their final 2-minute concluding comments. Richard first. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just do them from here. But to go through my 5 arguments, I talked about the origin of the universe. I think Andrew's main objection to that was to deny the causal principle, to suggest that some things can happen with no cause at all, which I don't find at all plausible. With regard to fine-tuning, Andrew tried to suggest that it doesn't need explaining. It just is. It's the way it is. You must judge for yourselves whether or not this incredible degree of fine-tuning, we can just dismiss it as, oh, that's the way it is, or if it needs explanation. I think it needs explanation. In terms of the origin of life, again, I think Andrew didn't acknowledge the fact that we can look at some things and we can recognize in them that they're beyond the reach of chance. They're beyond the reach of naturalistic processes. And I think that's the case with the origin of life. With regard to morality, I think we didn't really get to the end of the discussion. Again, evolution, society, reason, I've explained why they don't work. I think Andrew didn't offer us a reason why we have to accept our moral intuitions as authoritative. I think, to be honest, I think he slipped out of it in the end. Consciousness and free will, again, we ended up with the response that consciousness, that non-physical consciousness, does have an effect on the physical brain, which I would say is a supernatural view, and it's a very difficult one for an atheist to hold. In terms of Andrew's positive points that he put forward, again, I still think the genetic fallacy covers the vast majority of them. And the other thing was what I've come to refer to as the Santa issue, is attacking specific conceptions of God rather than the idea of God in general. So then the 5 arguments I put forward haven't been refuted. And I feel in response to the points that Andrew's put forward haven't been convincing arguments against God's existence. So I think you've heard a convincing case in favour of the existence of God.
Andrew?
Well, I'm not surprised that the proposition remains unconvinced by what I've said. All I would like to say by way of conclusion is that I still maintain what I said at the beginning, which is that if you want to believe in something, if you're going to believe in something, you need to have good evidence to suggest that that thing is true. And in a discussion like this, you need to be presented, therefore, with good evidence that isn't less reasonable than possible alternative evidence to think that something is true, and I don't think we've been presented with any evidence of that sort. I think, ultimately, in most of the arguments that have been advanced, not sufficient account has been taken of the fact of human fallibility. I find it extraordinarily odd that we who occupy a very small corner of the universe for a very brief amount of time should presume that we can know what the necessary laws of cause and effect that obtain at the beginning of the universe are. I quoted two ancient philosophers today, so I'm going to quote another one. Protagoras, again 2,500 years ago, famously wrote at the beginning of his philosophical work that about the gods he could say nothing, whether they existed or whether they didn't. And there were many reasons for his inability to say anything about it. One was that the obscurity of the topic, i.e. it was really impossible to ever find the terms or know everything that you would need to know to be able to draw conclusions about matters like matters of the gods, so obscure, so distant from human experience. And two, the brevity of human life, that it was impossible that we should ever live so long and know so much that we could understand really whether there was a God or not. And I think that's still true. I don't particularly think that debates like this are good ways of arriving at the truth. I think that people probably come with their own positions that are largely unalterable. I try to keep an open mind, but I still haven't seen anything that convinces me. I don't like these false challenges that sometimes come up in these debates. For example, when I was challenged about, is there any moral principle you can defend and so on and so forth. I want to give again a food analogy that I'll give a very quick food analogy, a fast food analogy. Rather like for morality again. Can you give me the reason why you want to eat? Well, you can't, but you do want to do it and you want to enjoy doing it. It's something that you do to live because you're in community with other people. You turn it into a shared experience. It's a process that's intrinsic to being human. This is... Well, you don't like analogies now. I can't believe it. I mean the whole of the last
This is
hour.
Into a three-course meal, that's all.
All right. Boom. I'll leave it there.
At the beginning, I was hoping that I suggested we would have a thought-provoking and intellectually stimulating evening, and I think if we've had nothing else, we've had that. And I'd like to thank, on your behalf, our two speakers for providing such fare in that way. If on those occasions I do go to a gym or do some exercise, sometimes I come out with my muscles aching, and I think it was a Monty Python line where they talked about my brain hurts. And maybe at the end of this sort of event, well, speaking for myself, that may be the case too. But I'd like to thank our speakers, Andrew and Richard, very much for providing that food for thought, literally, almost, food for thought, so that we can go away. And I think Andrew's one of his final points there about where we do come with preconceptions, and it is quite difficult perhaps to come with open minds to listen fully and take on board the views that others are promoting. But I trust as we go away we can think openly about the views that others, the views that we wouldn't necessarily hold, but we can think about them and respect them for those positions that they take. Thank you.
I think if we didn't have anything to talk about beforehand, we certainly do now. So if you want to know anything more about humanism or the Christian faith, there is a table over here with a few flyers and booklets and brochures of various description. Everything's free, so if you are interested in knowing a little bit more about either of the topics, do check out that table. There's also a purple fish stand over there, so if you want to know a little bit more about us and our future events, do come over. I'll be over there, have a word, or just check out some of the posters. Our next event I will quickly promote is a quiz night at the Unicorn Pub on the 23rd of March, and that's raising money for Hope House Children's Hospices, so it'd be brilliant if you're interested in coming along to that. We have a mailing list. Just sign your email address down on there. You can keep the pen, because that is just the kind of people we are. So do drop your email address down. That'd be brilliant. As for Andrew Copson, he does travel around the country and even the world. He's actually just got back from Norway. So if you want to keep up with what he's doing, check out humanism.org.uk. And he's also an avid Twitter person. I don't know the technical term, so he is on Twitter. So do follow him on there. Richard Lucas is speaking tomorrow morning, actually, at Carriglua Church, 10:45 on Laburnum Drive. So if you want to hear a bit more from Richard, you can catch him there. I think in the meantime, that is us. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. The bar will be open. Hang around, grab a drink, and just have some conversation, because that's what it's all about. So I think one more round of applause for Mr. Richard Lucas, Andrew Copson, and Mr. Paul Stockdale.